So, hello and welcome to Deep Dives, a new occasional podcast from MCC Brussels. In these conversations, we'll be going a little bit deeper with some of our authors, academics, friends, and politicians who we come across to explore some of the important issues facing Europe today. In today's podcast, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Norman Lewis. Norman, welcome.
Thank you.
We've invited Norman on because Norman, our visiting research fellow, is kind of our resident expert on all things technology. But for this time, he's just released a really great new report for us called Controlling the Narrative, the EU's attack on online speech. And we wanted to have the opportunity to kind of delve a little bit deeper into some of the themes of the report. I do really suggest that everybody goes and takes a look at it and have a read of the report. It's a really great read, and as we kind of said on Twitter, I think it even surprised those people who have already got kind of skeptical inclinations about what the EU's doing online. It's already that because Norman's really uncovered a huge morass of really worrying stuff about what the EU's doing online. But kick us off, Norman, I thought you could just kind of give us an outline of we'll get on to how the EU is actually controlling speech online. But what's the background to this impetus to why they feel they have to control speech online?
Well, I think, the first thing is very important for people to grasp is that the hate speech discussion is a narrative, and it's a narrative that is being deliberately fostered by the EU. Because what its real intention, what the impetus behind it really is not to protect minorities with protected characteristics or whatever from hateful or harmful speech, but it's really about curbing free speech, to control what can and cannot be said, what's legitimate and what's illegitimate from the EU's point of view. And who controls that then controls the entire narrative of elections, of what gets prioritized or whatever. So it's a very, very powerful and a very insidious thing, because it looks like one thing which seems harmless. I mean, who can be for hate or hate speech? But in reality, it's not about curbing hate, it's about curbing free speech. And the impetus behind it, I think that this is dealt a little bit with in the report, is the, I would call, the kind of structural weakness of the European elite. Because ever since the EU was formed, it's always been a top-down phenomenon. It's not rooted in popular sovereignty. And in order for them to legitimize their federalist project, they're always on the looking out for finding things that will give them authority, will appear to give them authority. And so the kind of hate speech thing has become very important, because they, by controlling what can and cannot be said, they essentially can outlaw points of view that challenge their federalist cosmopolitan outlook, which is what they want to essentially impose upon the demos across the member states. And so actually, when you look at the history of the EU, it really was formed around one central concern, which was to ensure that power would be centralized in a kind of bureaucracy at the center of the EU, which is in Brussels and the other institutions that they have, and deprive the people, any popular will, from having any real say over how things were administered. And so from the beginnings, its institutionalization was always one where the most important institutions, from the Commission, etc., these are not bodies that people can vote for. They're unelected, therefore unaccountable.
And so the kind of opposition that gets set up there is that they're not democratically accountable, and so then they always find themselves at various junctures and for different reasons, but standing in opposition to popular wishes or popular sovereignty, or at least having to deal with the fact that there's a kind of mass of people in Europe, and maybe they're unhappy about some element of the EU elite's agenda, and so they're always finding themselves at kind of cross purposes, and therefore the only way they have to deal with that pressure, because they can't engage with it democratically, is to try and silence it. Is that the point?
I think that's it. I think that's the problem for them, is that you can't just rule through negative the assertion of negative authority, i.e. what we're against as opposed to what we're for. There has to be some attempt to try and inspire, to get people to come up, to join, to be enthusiastic about being part of this. And so they've always looked for things that would give them some kind of moral grounds, moral right, spirit of vision or whatever. And the speech issue is a very important one from that point of view because, in fact, the first hate speech legislation that occurred in the EU was around the Holocaust, where they instituted Holocaust denial as a crime, which was imposed upon all the member states. And that was very, very important because that became the kind of moral ground upon which they could establish their right, which was, who could be for the Holocaust.
And so, like, protecting minorities, and so firstly protecting the kind of memory of the Holocaust as a positive thing, and then protecting. We're not closing down debate, right? We're just protecting minorities from kind of harmful content.
Precisely, that's it. But if you think about it, it's a very hateful and contemptuous attitude towards the people of Europe, because what you're really saying is that we have to protect you from yourselves. We have to protect you from harmful speech that. They have this notion that once you have hate speech, once you accept hate speech, there's an inexorable or a vortex of violence that leads to, hate speech leads to discrimination, then to physical attacks, rape, genocide. It's a
the whole of Europe's just a tinderbox waiting for the spark of hate speech, and then back to the 1940s.
So really, it kind of betrays a real contempt for ordinary Europeans, where the elite take it upon themselves to, they know what's best for everybody else, and therefore they would control what you can be exposed to. Because freedom of speech is not just about the right of the speaker, it's about the right of the audience to hear and to judge for themselves what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
And they want to deny that because they don't think people are capable of doing that. They don't think they have the moral independence to do that. But of course they do. They know what's best for everybody.
And one of the things that's really interesting in the report is how so many of these trends, which as you say are lurking in the kind of general background of the European Union and of EU elites for many decades, but they really come to a fore around 2016. Why is that?
Well, because 2016 we have Brexit, and we also have the election of Trump in America, and of course for the elites, this rocks them to the very foundation, because here we've got a member state who says no, we don't want to be a part of this anymore, and their fear is that they know that within Europe there's a lot of disgruntlement about the EU, etc., and that this would just be a kind of a start of a process. So the way they explained Brexit, that's the important thing, was that it was because of disinformation. People were lied to, and this is the gullible, stupid, working class people who bought this adverts on the side of buses and all that. The same kind of prejudice that was expressed by the Remainers, that they then felt that was the threat. From then onwards, they really go to town on making sure that they can control what's being said and what's legitimate within the EU, and that's where you see a real take-up. It also coincides with the growth of the internet and the whole social media stuff, because then social media, this whole kind of technologically determinist view of the world, that we're all like the technology is so powerful that we're just these vulnerable people who are just influenced because we can't take our eyes away from the screen, and all this crap that we see on the screen we believe because it's online, etc.
And the fact that somehow the Facebook algorithms, they just kind of almost by themselves made people vote for Brexit.
Exactly, and so this kind of narrative begins to form that says, once you allow this to happen, well, this is what happens. The slippery slope is you have Brexit, or you have someone like Trump being elected. The idea that Trump would be elected because of lies, that people weren't disgruntled or really angry about the elites and about the way that they had just been sidestepped in everything. That people wanted to take back control, as if this was the product of some external disinformation campaign, not based upon their real experience and life and their anti-political attitudes towards the elite at that time. This becomes a substitute, and a very conscious one, because they have to deflect from what is the core of this, which is that there is a real basis for why people would be opposed to them, why they would question their rule.
And I mean, you touched on there already the concepts of kind of hate speech and disinformation, and it's remarkable the degree to which even in official EU documents which try and lay these things out, that either they don't even bother to define what hate speech and disinformation are, or if they do, they're like so varied, they're constantly changing, and sometimes they're so wide. But why are these two concepts kind of so dangerous when it comes to regulating speech?
That's a very good question, because when I started doing this research, and I must say that when I began this research, I had a full head of hair, and after reading thousands of documents, legal documents about hate speech, the thing that I was tearing my hair out, hence my current disposition, is that there was I could never find a clear definition of what hate speech is, how you would define it, and how it varies from one year to the next, and how then suddenly new characteristics are added and all that. And I was thinking to myself, how can it be? This is a legal document. This is about criminalizing speech. And therefore, the taxonomy of a legal system has to be one that's extremely precise, because it has dire consequences. It has real consequences for people. How can it be this imprecision? Is this just because these people are lazy, thick, or whatever? And then I realized, dawned on me, and perhaps if I was smarter, it would have dawned on me a lot earlier, that this imprecision was deliberate. That the reason why it's deliberate is because that's really not what they're out to do. They're not trying to define what is hateful and make clarity about, so it begins with racism, then it begins with religion. But by the end of it, it's just like personal characteristics and stereotyping and all this kind of stuff, because it could be anything. What it's really about is not about protecting those characteristics or those minorities, but it's about free speech. It's about them establishing the right to determine what is correct speech and what isn't, what can be included, what's allowed to be said and what cannot be said. And it's about them controlling. That's the point. And so you suddenly realize that this kind of hate speech becomes in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
It can become anything. And it serves the same function, which is basically to close down debate. You close down the discussion about anything. So anybody, for example, who quite legitimately will say, well, a man who identifies as a woman is not a woman, who believes in biology, that can now be classified as hate speech because this is a minority that needs protection. And so what would be a absolutely fundamental debate, do we still believe in biology? Truth, reason, all these things is outlawed. And that's really what it comes down to. That's how far they are prepared to go. They are so prepared to destroy language as something that is the way we as human beings communicate and convey meaning to each other. They're prepared to destroy that in order to protect the status quo, in order to insulate themselves from that kind of pressure. Yeah. That's how far they're prepared to go.
And so with this all in the background, you kind of got these anti-speech attitudes, you've got these kind of dodgy concepts of disinformation and hate speech. How did the kind of EU's online censorship agenda take force? What kind of instruments or approaches do they have for actually regulating speech online?
Well, this is the thing that I found probably the most disturbing about how systemic this whole thing is. And the way to understand this is that it operates at a number of different levels. You have a number of players who are part of this. So the kind of policing the digital realm. You've got big tech. And allied to big tech, you've got these NGOs who are officially designated as fact checkers, as and they are the organisations that are basically, looking at what they're saying online and reporting anything that they see which is dubious. And of course, these NGOs are NGOs that are for gay rights or transgender rights or minority rights or whatever.
So you got the whole, for in your report, you got the whole panoply of all of you got the Open Society Foundation, ILGA Europe, you've got various kind of bodies of Amnesty International, and then thousands that you've never heard of.
Yeah, and then there's the designated experts and expert groups. If you go into the EU's database of their expert groups for all the areas of legislation, I mean, it's phenomenal. There's thousands of people. And the point about all of these people and the NGOs and from the Commission downwards is that what unites them is that no one in Europe has ever voted for them to be in the positions that they're in, to have the power that they have. And on top of that, then, you have the kind of legal infrastructure. So they brought in things like the Digital Services Act, which allows them to dictate what can and cannot be said online, content moderation. You have the Child Sexual Abuse Act, again, which is about controlling what kids can be exposed to, and therefore, they wanted to introduce these chat controls where they would, delve into people's encrypted conversations on things like WhatsApp or whatever. They wanted that to be swept aside so they could look out for child sexual abuse. You then have the Media Freedom Act, which again ring fences the attempt to try and centralize control in Brussels as opposed to having media pluralism in all the different member states. You have all these panoplies of laws which essentially closes off every loophole where there's the possibility that there could be views expressed that would be contrary to the narrative. And what I refer to in the report is I call this the censorship operating system. Mm-hmm. And I just want to explain something about this because, I mean, it's nice, I like the idea of the operating system because it's like the Apple operating system and all of that. Yeah. And, other people are talking about what do they call it, the censorship industrial complex or whatever. It's not a conspiracy. It's very important because the way it operates, and this is what's so insidious about it, is that it's an arm's length, dispassionate thing that exists. It's like the rule of law. So the commission, who makes sure that this law gets passed, that gives them the power to fine Facebook or X or whatever if they don't take something down that the EU doesn't like.
Yeah, and I mean today they're opening another investigation into
Meta. And they're doing it against TikTok, and they've done a few already against X. What they're doing is that so it's the rule of law. So the Commission then says you've got to take this down. Big tech, who we know, are not afraid of being censorious themselves, as we saw in the Trump, what happened with Trump and all that. They simply say, well, we're following the letter of the law. If we want to operate in Europe, then we've got to abide by the law. Yeah. So, we have to take this stuff down. The NGOs, who aren't accountable to anybody, who are flagging up the whole time, this is hate speech, whatever, they demand that big tech take this stuff down, or they report them to the Commission, and the Commission tells big tech, picks out the big stick and tells them what to do. What happens is censorship takes place, but no one's accountable. Mm-hmm. So the Commission can just say, well, this is the rule of law. We passed this, went through Parliament, it's all legitimate. Big tech, we have to do this because we haven't got a choice, because it's the basis of business. And the NGOs, well, they're not accountable to anybody. So it's what I call the unholy alliance of unaccountables. Yeah. And this is what the operating system is all about. And it is operating at a level where there is no accountability. And the point I just want to stress is that when you have authority without accountability, that's not authority, that's authoritarianism. And that's the point. That this operating system is the basis of a highly draconian authoritarian impulse in the EU. And that's a point that people just don't get.
And I think, calling an operating system actually really, draws attention to the way that this operates kind of as the general baseline expectation. And what ends up happening, as you really nicely illustrate in the report, is that the EU passes legislation, which of course doesn't say this particular post needs to be taken down. It says the platforms have to set up a system of content moderation that has to adhere to best practices and guidelines and all the rest of it. And then, okay, who's building the best practices and the guidelines and advising them on what constitutes hate speech? Well, then you got this whole army of NGOs that are out there, and as you say, constantly iterating. And every time they come up with a new definition, includes more and more and more stuff. And then big tech simply implement this in close consultation. And almost never does it actually find its way into the courts, as something you say. Why is that?
Well, because firstly, it just takes place. But the most important thing about this, and we can talk about the courts, because the courts play a very important role in this as well, again, unaccountable to the electorate, is that what happens is that what were initially the kind of thresholds with which you had to prove that there was criminal intent, i.e., hate speech, you had to prove that there was incitement to violence or whatever, and fair enough. I think there is a distinction to be made between free speech and incitement and in all those circumstances. We know, but that's covered by existing criminal law. The point is that as they expand the areas and the protected characteristics, and what then becomes what you need to prove the existence of a hate crime or a hate thought or whatever, the thresholds are being lowered all the time. And so then what you have then is that when it goes to the courts, and there's a couple of cases that I cite in the report, you see that they suddenly, the courts are determining, when freedom of expression is legitimate or when it's not. And you even have cases where politicians in an election are being fined for comments that are being made on their posts on Facebook. And so, unbeknown to anybody else, during an election, a politician becomes the owner of what's published on a platform that they don't own. So that, they almost become a publisher, and they get shut down. And this is during an election that this takes place. This is done through the courts. And then once the court sets that as the precedent, then they use that in the subsequent cases.
Yeah, that's baked into the operating system from then on.
Absolutely. So the whole thing just becomes a kind of self-reinforcing ring that just inexorably, the only thing that's inexorable is not the violence, inexorably is shutting down debate.
Yeah. And one of the points you make in the report is that big tech have been so happy to go along with this because they kind of see it as a cost of doing business, especially in Europe. And maybe, as we know, lots of the people running big tech organizations and involved in the kind of content moderating systems, they're pretty hostile to free speech as well.
Yeah.
But all the commission has to do is kind of intimate that further restrictions might be coming. And so many of the big tech players are kind of lining up to go along with it. And as you say, the commission kind of considers it a victory that they would never, when they have to use the enforcement mechanisms, they consider that a failure because they've failed to regulate the speech without causing a public outcry.
Yeah, what really shocked me, and this was a real eye-opener to me, is that I didn't realize this, but in 2016, there was a code of conduct that was struck between the commission and big tech. This was in the lead up to the last.
That's not legislation, right? That's
not legislation.
Supposedly voluntary.
It didn't go through Parliament. It was a deal that they did in the back, and that was cooperation around beginnings of what I then go on to talk about in the report, which is the automation of hate speech regulation, and they experimented with that. But what's amazing is that the number of things that were taken down, on YouTube, on Facebook or whatever, and how they were boasting about this and how they began to see that they could use these systems to train them to spot so that they, because, the millions of tweets and posts, etc. on Facebook, it's impossible for humans to keep track of everything. So you do it with an algorithm. And so they used this to train the algorithms. But not only that, they did campaigns in the public where they got 30 NGOs to launch a campaign called We Believe in Better or something. I can't remember exactly what. And this reached millions of people. And this was a test to see they were testing the water. Because all of this then ends up as a piece of legislation as the Digital Services Act. And that was the testing of the water.
Yeah.
And the point about the Digital Services Act, and it's a point that I think is probably the most dangerous thing of all, is the increasing use now of artificial intelligence, generative AI, to create a system of automating hate speech detection and takedown.
Yeah, you call it in the report automated authoritarianism.
Yeah. And that's what it is. And you cannot, the amount of money that they're spending on this, the amount of attention, because think of it from big tech's point of view. I mean, of course, AI, all the hype around that everybody's doing that anyway. But it means you can get rid of people. Yeah. It means you can have systems that should be more robust or whatever. And it means that their ability to comply with the DSA and the time pressure that the DSA puts them under means that it makes their life easier. Because once they've got these systems in place, it's almost like they can say, well, we'll have to ask the algorithm to do that. It's like it's not someone in the company who's accountable for that. So when the commission points a finger and says, you should take this down, they can act with haste in a way that they couldn't do in the past.
Yeah, they can just tweak it for every new kind of obsession that comes up. If they're worried about the far right, they can do that. If they're worried about the farmers' protests, they can do that. If they're worried about people questioning the Green Deal, they can suddenly add in a little tweak to the algorithm and the timeline changes.
Exactly. And so what we have here is we have this kind of automated semantic engineering at a level where the kind of authoritarians would wet dream, because you've now got the ability to tweak this to such an extent that you can shut down anything that you deem to be illegitimate. And so we are reaching a point where this becomes a real danger to the future, because you're shutting down debate. Most importantly, and you made a reference to this, a lot of this is going on behind closed doors.
Yeah.
Because if you go to the data, the transparency
database, that has all this information on what gets taken down.
Yeah, or the DSA. Yeah. And you look at it. I mean, you go from one day to the next, and there are thousands and thousands of posts that are being taken down. If you look for hate speech, you suddenly realize that there are hundreds of thousands of things being taken down. You don't know what is there because they don't give you the content.
Tell you what they've taken down.
So, that's between them and the NGOs and the fact checkers and some of the researchers that have got access.
It's like if there was a criminal system where people were going to prison, but you never had any idea what they were being sent to prison for.
Yeah, but more than that, you don't even know that this crime is being committed until and if a big tech transgresses the law, and then suddenly it comes out into the public where, so we hear Meta has been fined 10 million euros or 10 billion euros because they failed to do so. And suddenly you say, what? It's like it's medieval. I mean, I make this point, it's medieval. It's like the only time there's a crime being permitted is when the authorities allow public hanging. And so we don't even know this is going on. So it's like an unaccountable system that is hidden from being accountable to anybody. And this is all just going on.
And the only people that get to see what's being taken down are, of course, the army of NGOs that they have to help police it.
And of course, the commission, and who are, obviously sitting back, drinking their champagne and saluting, artificial intelligence. And I want to make a really, really important point about this. I wrote about this in my previous report about the precautionary principle and how risk-averse the EU are on regard. And so the Artificial Intelligence Act, which is the first big global regulation of AI, has been heralded as this great, wonderful piece of work because it's ring-fenced the areas that they regard as risky, high-risk AI.
Yeah.
And
it's supposed to the principle is that AI could have potentially dangerous consequences on society, and so we've got to keep the use of AI in check.
Exactly.
And that's ironic.
Absolutely ironic. And not only that, when they think that social media, determines everything, all of a sudden they become converts to generative AI because they're using it to fulfill their own needs, which is, to take down language, to to suppress speech. And so all of a sudden, the precautionary principle and all the risks, the existential risks that we face in society are out the window. Yeah. No one's talking about that.
Well, because there's an even bigger risk, right, which is the risk of unhindered public discussion, which might go in a direction that the EU elite doesn't like.
And they know, with inverted commas, they know that if you don't stop that harmful speech, it's going to result in, the end of civilization.
Yeah. Well, and that's a narrative, right, that's really big at the moment in the run-up to the European elections. They're really, really worried about what is being said and what the results might be, and how people at the ballot box might deliver a little bit of a blow to the kind of immigration agenda, the Green Deal. People are sympathizing with the farmers' movements.
Absolutely.
What should we be looking out for in the run-up to the election with this kind of automated system of censorship?
Well, I think wherever they talk about disinformation, that should alert us to the fact that it's their disinformation that they're really purveying. I think what we should be doing, and I hope we're going to be doing this in every and any piece of tweet or anything on social media, anything that the EU puts out, we should really scan it very carefully and expose it and show that this is not truth, that this is their disinformation. They want to talk about hatred, their hatred of the demos. We should expose the fact that the real disinformation campaign is the one that's being led by them, which is that we should be protected from harmful speech, because that is a disinformation narrative, right? That is a narrative that sees democracy as the problem.
Yeah.
And this is the amazing thing, isn't it? That we're living in a society that's heralded as being championed as this global champion of democracy.
Well, yeah, today there's a new campaign launched by some godless NGO that's talking about how we need a big campaign for democracy. They don't ever mention what democracy is. They don't say anything about free speech and democracy at all. But so the EU is this bastion, this beacon of democracy, but actual substantive democracy is the thing that they can't stand.
And what they're talking about, they don't talk about freedom of speech, because what they believe now is that the right path, the righteous path for the future, is to protect Europeans from speech. So speech is the big thing, right? And it's not just any speech. It's speech that they don't like, speech that threatens them, that questions them, that whatever. Yeah. So, I would say when we write in the report that, the EU today is characterized by not upholding free speech but freedom from speech. It's not a rhetorical flourish. It really is true. And this is not something that's temporary. It's not just in the run-up to this election. This is systemic. And not only that, it's going to get worse. It's going to get more and more. The more that there is opposition within the EU, they have to look for external actors, anything but themselves, for the reason why, for example, the far right, are gaining ground on what we're going to see in the elections and everything. Yeah. And you can be damn sure of two things. Depending on what happens in the election, if the far right do well, then they're going to blame it on fake news, and they'll come up with all this.
And then there'll be more legislation.
If they don't do as well as everybody says, well, thankfully we were able to curb some of the fake news.
And democracy prevailed.
And democracy prevails, exactly. Yeah. It's the most anti-democratic narrative in the world.
Well, I think we can certainly, in the run-up to the election, as you say, kind of take every time they mention hate speech, every time they mention disinformation, they talk about fake news. Yeah. People can know that in the background is this censorship operating system that you've done such a great job in the report of illustrating. I hope everybody does go and delve into the report. There's loads of examples, things that, as I said, I think will kind of even shock you. I think Norman's done a really great job of exposing this also. Norman, thanks so much, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great. Thank you.